Hello, dear colleagues, and thank you for your interest in applying for the Developing Hispanic Serving Institutions Programs FY 2025 competition for new awards. And thank you especially for all that you do on behalf of your students and your communities. My name is Margarita L. Melendez, and I serve as the Program Lead and Competition Manager for the DHSI program. A few preliminaries before we begin the review of the PowerPoint slides. This PowerPoint, the application package, the Federal Register Notice Inviting Applications, or NIA, resources for developing the logic model, and other documents are all posted to Grants.gov. Before I begin the presentation, I will provide the highlights for this year's competition, and during this time, the slides will not move. The deadline to apply is Thursday, July 3rd, 2025 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. There is no grace period, so please apply early. For this year, there is no absolute priority. However, there are 2 competitive preference priorities and 1 invitational priority. It is optional to respond to the competitive preference and invitational priorities. DHSI projects are for 5 years. You will receive your funding through a non-competing continuation cycle, or NCC, and if you are selected for funding, you will receive your Year 1 funding by September 30th, 2025. The start date for new grants will be October 1, 2025, which is the beginning of the federal fiscal year 2026. For individual development grants, the only type for which you may apply this year, the maximum amount for each year is $600,000, with an estimate average size of $575,000 and a total maximum amount of $3 million over the 5-year grant period. As noted in the Federal Register, we have approximately $66,944,786 for new grants, and we plan to make around 116 new awards. However, the department is not bound by these estimates. You may only submit 1 application for an individual development grant in this competition. If you need to make a revision to your grant submission, you may go back into Grants.gov and make the revision. However, please note that we will review the most recent timestamp submission in Grants.gov. Please ensure that your school has updated its Unique Entity Identifier, or UEI, which replaced the DUNS number recently. DUNS numbers, as you may recall, are issued by the private firm Dun & Bradstreet. Grants.gov will not accept your application without a proper and updated UEI. You must follow the common instructions referenced in the NIA for submitting your application. However, as noted in the recommended page limit section, the page limit, 55 pages, and formatting regarding the 12-point font, which is suggested as Courier, Courier New, Times New Roman, or Arial, are recommended, not required, and apply to the project narrative section only. They do not apply to the required forms, the CVs, or other attachments. Even though the 55-page limit for the project narrative is recommended and not required, please keep in mind the readability of your application. If you submit a 300-page project narrative, you may annoy the peer reviewers who are evaluating your proposal. Peer reviewers will review around 7 to 10 applications each. So it is in your best interest to make your applications clear and readable. which also includes closely following the order of the selection criteria in the NIA as you develop your project narrative. And please note that you do not need to double space tables, graphs, charts, the logic model, or the abstract. It is fine to single space these items. And yes, logic models may be more than one page if you choose. In order to apply to the DHSI program competition, your IHE must be designated as an eligible institution for Titles 3 and 5 programs. Detailed information on the eligibility process will be provided in the presentation that follows. If you would like ideas or want to learn about successfully funded projects, please go to the Awards tab of the DHSI program webpage and review the abstracts listed by fiscal year. Please note that you must submit the DHSI program profile form, which is included in the application booklet. If you do not include the DHSI program profile form, your application may be deemed ineligible. In addition to submitting the required program profile form, we also strongly encourage you to submit your eligibility letter with your application package. Your eligibility letter is available in the IHE's dashboard in the HEPAS system under the Grant Eligibility Application section. And as a reminder, the HEPAS system is available at HEPAS, that's HEPIS.ed.gov. If your institution currently holds a DHSI, an HSI STEM, or a POHA grant, you are eligible to apply for DHSI in this competition. Likewise, if your institution currently holds a FIPSI grant, such as an open textbook grant, a rural post-secondary grant, or a modeling and simulation program group grant, you are also eligible to apply for DHSI in this competition. On the other hand, if your institution currently holds a Title III, Part A, or Part B grant, such as a Strengthening Institutions Program or SIP grant, an NPC grant, a TCCU grant, ONSTI grants, NONSTI grants, or other of the MSI grants within Titles 3, Part A or B, you may not apply for the DHSI program. We have a slide in the PowerPoint that lists all of the programs in reference to this matter, so you can review that if you are unsure of your eligibility. Please note that as opposed to some of our other programs under the DHSI program, you may not, I repeat, you may not charge indirect costs under the grant. Finally, please be aware that in addition to this technical assistance pre-recorded webinar, we will also be offering live Q&A sessions. Please check the flyer with the schedule in the Related Documents tab on Grants.gov. Now we will begin the presentation, and I will begin to advance the slides. So just reminding everyone that any information that is provided today is provided only for the purpose of assisting you through technical assistance, and the information in the NIA, as well as the statutes and the regulations referenced therein, supersede any technical assistance that may be provided. The NIA, in other words, is your official guidance for applying for this program. So the purpose of our workshop today is to familiarize you with the DHSI program and requirements, to make sure that you understand the application process, as well as the Grants.gov system, to provide you with information on how the competition is managed and to ensure that you are fully equipped with the information needed to apply successfully. So, some highlights about our grant competition this year. So, as you may know, if you've reviewed the NIA and Grants.gov already, we published on June 3rd. We will be closing on Thursday, July 3rd at midnight. You must follow the common instructions that are available on Grants.gov. You may only submit one application or an individual development grant under this competition. I've already reviewed the amount of estimated funds and the number of awards that we plan to make, so I will move on to the next slide. Some of the competition highlights that I mentioned previously is that there is no absolute priority this year. However, we do have two competitive preference priorities that we will discuss in a few moments. There is one invitational priority. Your responses to both of these priorities are optional. However, as many of you know, if you do respond to one or both of the competitive priorities, you do increase your chances of being funded. And as I stated before, the page limit and formatting are recommended and not required. Also, we do ask that if you are intending to apply for the program, that you send us a notice of intent to apply at our shared mailbox, which is hsi at ed.gov. HSI as in Hispanic Serving Institutions at educationdepartment.gov, G-O-V. There is no deadline for that. You don't need to send the intent. You don't have to submit something if you send an intent and then you change your mind. And if you don't send this an intent, you can still submit an application. So how does the review process work? It's rather straightforward. The applications are submitted through Grants.gov. Qualified peer reviewers are selected by our program to evaluate the application. Each panel consists of 3 non-federal peer reviewers and 1 federal panel monitor. Those peer reviewers will read, review, and rate the applications individually prior to their panel calls. And then those peer reviewers come together during the panel calls to further discuss the details of the application and to finalize scores and comments. Once that panel review process has been completed, a list of rank order of new awards is developed based on the list of scores that has been ranked through the G5 system. After that memo is developed and goes through all of the proper department clearances, notifications are sent to Congress first, your 2 senators and your representative, and then if you have been selected, you are notified that you successfully applied. Let's provide a brief overview of the DHSI program. So this information is from the DHSI program statute. DHSI, as most of you may know, is part of Title V, Part A. Title V, Part B is the POHA program. Under Title V, Part A, you may submit an application that is not restricted to undergraduate or graduate. It's not restricted by academic discipline. It is the widestly available of the programs that we manage, and it also has the greatest amount of funding. So there is a lot of flexibility in how you can develop your projects. We will review the allowables and the unallowable activities in just a moment, but I do want to remind you of the purpose of the program, which is to expand educational opportunities and improve academic attainment for Hispanic students. But because this is an institutional grant program, I also want to remind everyone that the purpose of these programs, yes, the ultimate outcome is to improve outcomes for the students, but these are institutional grants. So as part of the development of your application, you will be developing a comprehensive development plan or a CDP that will look at the academic offerings, program quality, and institutional stability of your institutions, and how you can improve those to ultimately improve the academic achievement of the students that you are serving. So this slide is shared with you simply for your reference. Please make sure you are aware of our statute and our regulations. The regulations include not just EDGAR, Education Department General Administrative Regulations, but it also includes uniform guidance, so 2 CFR Part 200, as well as the pertinent OMB grants management circulars. Allowable activities for Title V, as you can see, they are many and they are varied. Please know that as part of screening your application to make sure that you are eligible and that you have followed grant program requirements, we will, this list of allowable activities will be part of the pre-screening form. So in addition to that pre-screening form that we use on our end, on the DHSI program project profile, you also have to check off which allowable activities are covered by your application. So it is very important that you review those allowable activities and that you ensure that the project that you are designing includes several of these allowable activities. So you will notice, for example, number 2 includes construction, renovation, and maintenance. And that is, one of the many good things about this program, because there are a lot of Department of Education programs that do not allow for any type of construction or renovation. Our programs do. So that is definitely a good thing. Things such as renovating your libraries, renovating your scientific laboratories are also included, as well as, purchasing books and other educational materials. And as we'll talk about in another moment, you can also establish an endowment fund for your project with the DHSI program funds. Here are some additional allowable activities. I'll just mention that number 10, for example, speaks to improving your telecommunication and your distance education offerings. So, in this current time with online learning, hybrid learning as well, if you want to address that issue as part of your application, that is certainly something that is allowed, as well as I'd also draw your attention to the fact that you can use the program funds to establish teacher education programs. So this is mostly provided as a reference to remind everyone that under the additional activities authorized under the HEA reauthorization of 2008, activities related to financial and economic literacy were added as authorized activities, as well as articulation agreements that support students transferring from 2-year to 4-year institutions. So as a reminder, those 2-year institutions would be community, technical, and junior colleges. We know that a great number of Hispanic and low-income students begin their post-secondary career at community and junior colleges. So that is good to know that that is one of the things that you are permitted to do under this program, as well as to provide more customized support for students in that first first block. So student support services, whether it be academic tutoring, career advising, and similar types of activities. I mentioned the endowment fund a few moments ago, so you can use up to 25% of your grant funds to establish an endowment or to enhance an endowment that the institution may already have. Please understand, though, that if you do establish or add to an existing endowment, you are required to provide matching funds from non-federal sources at 100%. So dollar for dollar matching funds. So as you consider whether or not you want to do this, it's very important that you consider whether or not you'd be able to come up with the required matching funds. So there are some unauthorized activities under Title V, Part A. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but it is very important that you review these unauthorized activities as you're putting your project narrative together. We will be screening for unauthorized as well as authorized activities, and also be aware that if you do include unauthorized activities as part of your application package, your program funding could be reduced proportionally to those unauthorized activities that you've included. So having said that, it is best not to include any type of unauthorized activities in your project because it will not be approved and it does put in jeopardy the entirety of your grant application. Here are some additional unauthorized activities that are included in that list. Probably the most important one that I would mention from this particular slide is that you are not able to pay with grant funds any portion of the salary of a president, vice president, or equivalent officer who has college-wide administrative authority and responsibility. If these individuals want to be a part of this grant, they can certainly be a part of this grant, but they could not be paid for with grant funds. The reason for this is because this program is also subject to the supplement, not supplant requirement, and therefore, if you use grant funds to pay for these individuals that would otherwise be paid through the grant, then you are violating the supplement, not supplant requirement. Also, any kinds of organized fundraisings, endowment drives, or things like that, as well as direct student recruitment for the university. Again, that's part of supplement, not supplant, to which this program is subject to, so you could not use grant funds to pay for any of those activities as well. Also, with respects to scholarships, in most cases, scholarships are not allowed under Title V, Part A. Please make sure that you review this carefully. Under the provision noted there, financial assistance such as scholarships, fellowships, and other student aid are generally not allowable, except when the purpose of the award is to provide training to participants. As these are not training grants, these items would not generally be allowable under our program. Let's talk a little bit about eligibility. So first of all, we need to make it very clear that the department does not designate any HSI as a Hispanic serving institution or a minority serving institution. What we do is we review your IPEDS data and we determine whether or not your institution is eligible for certain types of funding. So in this case, your IHE must be designated as eligible for Title V, Part A. Unlike HBCUs, for example, your eligibility is something that is determined on an annual basis. So just because you have been an HSI in the past, that does not guarantee HSI. I'm using that colloquially. Just because you've met our requirements, that does not in the past, that does not mean that you are necessarily eligible now. So please ensure that you have a copy of your eligibility letter from the HEPA system that I mentioned earlier. And also know that that annual eligibility matrix that is published every year should be published. The newest one, we hope that that will be published within the next couple of weeks or so. So that's a second check on your eligibility, in addition to your eligibility letter from HEPAS, to ensure that you do meet the requirements to submit an application under our program. So as I've stated before, in addition to the information that you will provide on the DHSI project profile form, make sure you also include a copy of your eligibility letter in your application package. So just a reminder of what the eligibility process looked like this year, as that eligibility process has already closed. It was announced in the Federal Register via a notice on March 6th. The enrollment and fiscal data that was used for this year's determination was the 2022 to 23 year, and the deadline for submitting any waiver requests was on April 7th. There's a little bit of more information on the types of data that were used for making current year determinations. As far as this slide is concerned, what I want to draw your attention to is that very last bullet there, reminding you that your program profile form is required for DHSI as part of the application process. So I think this is the third time I may have mentioned it, but it's worth mentioning it again. In order for your application package to be complete, you must submit that DHSI program profile form, and we are also asking you to submit a copy of your eligibility letter. So I mentioned in my opening remarks that if you have certain types of grants, you may or may not be eligible to apply under the DHSI program this year. So let's look first at the right-hand side. So if you currently have a DHSI grant or a POHA grant or a STEM grant managed by our division or any of the other grant program projects in the column on the right side, then you are eligible to apply for DHSI this year. However, if your institution holds any of the grants listed on the left-hand side of this slide, such as the SIP grant or a TCCU grant, tribal colleges, or an NAPC, or the NOTSTI, which is one of the Native American programs. If your institution currently has an active grant in any of those programs, you are not eligible to apply for DHSI this year. So please make sure that you consult with your Office of Sponsored Programs or the relevant colleagues at your IHE, and make sure that the college or university does not have one of these grants before you begin to put in time and effort in preparing your application for DHSI. So let's talk about the most important thing today right now, the selection criteria and the priorities. I think most of you probably know that the largest part of your application package will be your responses to the selection criteria. So it may seem self-evident, but let me just remind everyone how you should be putting this together. So the selection criteria is composed of factors, and the way that you should be designing that project narrative is that you will provide a response to every factor for every single selection criteria, because that is how the peer reviewers will review your application. They will look at each factor under each selection criteria, and they will review your response to those factors. You should go in order in which they were published in the NIA. When you don't go in order, it's frustrating for everyone, and it's very difficult to gauge the quality of your application when you design your narrative in a different order. So please follow the order of the factors of the selection criteria as part of your narrative. And remember, this is not an exercise in creative writing. This is an exercise where you are responding directly and appropriately to every factor for every selection criteria. Quality of the content is key, so ensure that you are comprehensive and exhaustive in your responses, as well as providing the appropriate evidence for data that you provide or any claims that you make. I've already spoken before about readability, but again, consider that the peer reviewers are reviewing a number of applications. And if the formatting and the organization and the way that you've laid out or written your application is difficult, this is going to cause frustration for the peer reviewers. And that is something that we always try to avoid. So consider readability as you are drafting your responses, as well as the actual layout and formatting of your application package. So there are 8 selection criteria this year. And for those of you who are familiar with the program, you'll see that this is pretty much essentially what we have been doing for a number of years, as the selection criteria is statutory. There are, as I said, 2 competitive priorities this year worth 10 points each, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. So a perfect application, it's very hard to write a perfect application, but were a perfect application to be written, you could potentially receive a total possible score of 120 points. So the heart of your application is that comprehensive development plan that I mentioned a moment ago. So that is where you review the strengths and weaknesses of your college and university in terms of 3 areas: your academic programs, your institutional management. So this means your administrative side, as well as your fiscal stability. So many folks think of this as like a SWOT exercise. So you should, you need to conduct a comprehensive review of the institution's strengths and weaknesses with regards to those 3 areas. And then you have to develop goals for your project based on what you found as part of that needs assessment for those 3 areas. The objectives that you develop should be developed in relation to the goals. Again, those goals are developed in relation to the strengths and weaknesses of those 3 areas. And then, as part of the strengths and weaknesses that you found, the goals developed as a result of that analysis, the objectives that have been developed to support the attainment of those goals. Based on those preliminary factors, you will develop a plan that clearly and comprehensively describes the methods that you will use to develop the offerings of your institution. Part of that plan, as the last factor within the selection criteria indicates, is that you will not just provide a plan addressing the items listed in factor number 4, but in factor number 5, you will ensure that this plan, as you have created it, is a 5-year plan. Remember, this is a 5-year project. So what factor number 5 does is it brings you back to the fact that, yes, you have a broad plan, but this is a 5-year project, so you must develop it in a way that it can be implemented within 5 years. So that last bullet is especially critical as well. That 5-year plan could clearly state how the institution, were it to be funded, would improve its services to Hispanic and low-income students. You should specifically show how those services will, how that 5-year plan will improve services to Hispanic and low-income students, and peer reviewers are looking specifically that you affirm that through this 5-year plan, you will improve services to Hispanic and low-income students. Moving on then to the project design, as many of you know, the department over the years has been placing greater and greater emphasis on evidence building and having strong evaluation design. So in that spirit, we continue to use this project design criterion where we require both the development of a logic model and citation of promising evidence studies. So we are going to provide a number of resources on developing your logic model in some further slides. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about how you would do that in this particular section of your application. So let me state right now that even though you do not see the word logic model in the first factor, the definition of demonstrates a rationale in the NIA specifically states that you demonstrate a rationale by creating a logic model. So if you don't include a logic model in your application, you cannot receive maximum points in this area because you demonstrate that rationale through a logic model. I just want to make sure that that is abundantly clear to everyone. The first factor requires the development of a logic model. And then the second factor speaks to the promising evidence studies on which you are basing your project. So as you design your project, we never want to design projects simply based on somebody's good idea, but based on evidence that certain project components work as demonstrated through studies that have been vetted. The What Works Clearinghouse of the Department's Institute of Education Studies has a number of evidence tiers. And the promising evidence tier is the one that we are requiring for this particular project. So the studies, the research articles, or the other evaluation studies that you are submitting to support the evidence base of your project must meet the standard of at least promising evidence. So if you're able to find studies that meet the moderate evidence standard or the strong evidence standard, that's great. We don't require it. At the very least, the studies that you submit as part of the evidence for your design must meet that promising evidence standard. You'll speak somewhat, you will speak to that in your response to factor 2 of the selection criteria. But what I was trying to get to is that in addition to speaking to that in a narrative form in this factor, you also are required to actually cite those evidence studies on the evidence form, which is one of the required forms that you must submit with your application package. So as you are gathering the information for your evidence, make sure that you remember that in addition to responding to this factor, you also have to list the actual studies on the evidence form. So just to clarify again, in order to meet that requirement of demonstrates a rationale, which is worth 10 out of 15 points for the selection criterion, you must provide a logic model. The logic model should be a snapshot of your entire project that demonstrates items such as your resources and your assumptions. It would include outputs as well as outcomes and short, mid, and long-term goals. So it is much more comprehensive and detailed than an abstract, and it provides an evidence-based, a research-based understanding of what it is you're trying to do and how you plan to do it. The activity objectives, I talked about that a little bit when I was talking about the very first selection criterion, comprehensive development plan. These objectives should be built on the responses that you provided to the very first selection criteria, quality of the comprehensive development plan. So the objectives that you are listing here should be directly based on the goals of that CDP that you clearly outlined in your response to the first selection criteria. Please ensure that your goals are realistic and defined, okay? And that they are directly related to the problems to be solved and to the goals of the CDP. So, just so to visualize it, you have your goals at the top, okay? Most projects will have between 2 to 5 or maybe 6 goals. So you should not have a lot of goals, but you will have several objectives. So you would have, say, just for illustrative purposes, maybe 2 to 3 objectives under one goal, maybe 3 to 4 objectives under another goal. Those objectives would include what you were trying to, the things that you were trying to accomplish in order to meet the goal. And there would be activities related to those objectives, which are related directly to the goals. The implementation strategy is where you explain how you are putting all of this together. So you provide an overview of how your approach to actually getting the work done. In other words, how you're implementing this project is comprehensive. So you've said all of these things that exist, that need to happen, and that you'd like to do. The implementation strategy is where you explain how you are actually going to do that. You should provide a narrative explanation on how each activity will be implemented. Remember that those activities are related to the objectives, which are subsumed under the goals. In addition to describing how you're going to do all of these things, so you've talked about what you're going to do, why you're going to do it. Now you're talking about how you're going to do it. The rationale for the implementation strategy is why you are doing it this way. Why have you decided that this is the best way to approach how the work is actually going to get done? So the rationale for your implementation strategy should be clearly described, and it should be supported by the results of relevant studies for your projects. So this is where you can again draw on those promising evidence studies. So you included in the previous selection criterion promising evidence, but that promising evidence should support relative components of your project, including how you are going to implement the actual work. Let me also take a moment with regard to the promising evidence studies. Just make a note here that with those promising evidence studies, you do not have to have promising evidence for every single component of your project, but you should have at least one promising evidence study for at least one major project component of your grant. Now, if you have promising evidence to support several of your project components, then you make your project that much more stronger. The more evidence that you can provide regarding the greatest number of project components for your for your grant application, the stronger your application becomes. The last point regarding your implementation strategy is that you should ensure that you explain how the timetable for each of these activities that are taking place is realistic and likely to be attained. given the capacity at your college or university. So moving on then to project management. So here we're talking specifically about all the folks in the background who are actually making all of this happen. So please describe very clearly and effectively how the procedures for managing the project will ensure effective and efficient implementation. And also, please make sure you include this because the peer reviewers are looking for this. Make sure that you describe how the project coordinator and the activities coordinators activity directors will have sufficient authority to conduct the project effectively. And this includes access to the president or the CEO of the college or universities. Now, to avoid any types of confusion, let me clarify that project coordinator is used simultaneously with project director. Activity director may also be used simultaneously with a project manager. Some of our projects have a full-time project director, so there may not be an activity director or project manager. That is fine. The main point here is that those key people who are making the project happen and who have oversight for the project, so the project director and the activity director, project manager, they have the authority to make things happen and they have access to senior leadership at the institution. It's very clear that you must make it very clear that this would be the case were you to be funded. Part of making this clear is to include an organizational chart. So again, I am strongly recommending that that you include an organizational chart to demonstrate that these key individuals do indeed have access to the president or the CEO. And then for the last factor here, please note that I have highlighted it as well as also included in all caps and in red the words new. This is a new factor under the selection criteria, so please make sure that you consider this carefully and develop a thoughtful response. This factor has to do with making sure that you are financially responsible in your project manage approach. So describe specifically and with detail how the procedures for your fiscal control and your funding accounting procedures are likely to ensure proper disbursement and accounting of funds. So, having emphasized that this is a new factor and that it is very important, I would take this opportunity to remind everyone that as part of the terms and conditions of the grant, one of the things that all of our grants are required to do as a condition of having one of these grants is they must develop an internal controls manual. So think about how your response to this factor goes along with the development of your internal controls manual and how, there will be, very careful and thoughtful oversight of the federal side of managing your grant. So again, this is a new factor. Please make sure that you address it, very comprehensively. Moving on then to key personnel. So in this section, please describe how the individuals that would be managing this grant are qualified to do so. So of course, you would include the CVs of, the project director, activity director, project manager, and all of those kinds of individuals, as part of your attachments. But in addition to providing those CVs, it's very important that you describe here very directly. How is this person qualified to be a project director of a $3 million federal grant? Remember also in the CVs, sometimes for academic CVs, they can be very long. You may want to consider providing abbreviated CVs that focus more on an individual's qualifications regarding management or contributions to a federal grant, and how their qualifications, experience, and expertise will contribute in a positive way to this grant. So again, in this section, it's not just about how many degrees the person has or how many things that they've published. Those are all very good. We want to make sure that the folks managing these are academically qualified, but as the factor here clearly states, their experience and their training related to the work that's actually going to be done, that is the most important factor. So if you would be appointing someone who has previous experience managing a grant of of this nature, then that's something that you would want to emphasize here, because then you have you have good assurance that it would be well managed, because that individual either has the past experience or they have the right skill set to manage a grant of this size and of this nature. Also very important, and you'll notice that this is actually worth 3 points, so a little bit more than the first one, is the time commitment. This comes up a lot as we are, monitoring our grants. We want to make sure that those key individuals, that they are devoting sufficient time to these projects. We don't say here that you need to have a specific level of effort. But remember that the peer reviewers who will be evaluating your applications, they're your peers. They're in the field just as you are, and they know what makes sense for these types of grants, and they know, what level of effort would mean proper administration of a program. So keep that in mind as you are responding to that time commitment factor. Moving on then to the evaluation plan. So these factors, first of all, I want to mention the factors under the evaluation plan do not speak to whether or not you have to have an internal or an external evaluator. That is something that each applicant is going to decide on its own. You can have an internal evaluator, you can have an external evaluator, you can have a combination of an internal and an external evaluator. We've actually been seeing that quite a bit in recent years, and it does seem to work very well because your internal folks, they know your data systems, they're familiar with the culture at your IHE, so they bring some strengths, and then your external evaluator, they also bring their expertise as well as objectivity. So before I wrap up that sort of preamble to this section, I do want to just highlight that we have included a resource on hiring an evaluator as one of the documents that you can find on Grants.gov. So as far as your evaluation plan, what we're looking at here, most importantly, is how the data that you are gathering relative to your grant is able to demonstrate that you are actually meeting your goals and objectives and in the way that you said you were going to do it. So data is key. So for that reason, the very first factor is where you would, properly describe how the data elements and the data procedures that you plan to use as part of your evaluation plan are clearly described and appropriate to your particular project. So as you're thinking about an evaluation design, many of our projects have mixed methods, just because of the nature of these programs. But if you're doing mixed methods, or if you decide you want to land on one particular method or approach, you always need to consider, is this the best method for the type of project that I'm implementing? And what kind of data would you need in order to properly, execute that evaluation plan. So that's the case that you're making in this first factor. You know the data elements that you're going to need to properly report on your progress. You know what kind of data collection procedures you have to have in place in order to get that data, and that this approach to the data is going to actually be able to help you see whether or not you're meeting your goals and objectives, which at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you are addressing the weaknesses of the comprehensive development plan, as well as building on the strengths that that comprehensive development plan identified. The way you figure out whether you're being successful is directly through the evaluation plan. That's why it's very important that we consider all of the factors that go into designing that evaluation plan. So the second factor builds on the first. So we have the data itself and the data collection procedures. That's the first part. But once you have all the data, you have to analyze it and you have to be able to draw a conclusion and tell a story based on that data. So the second factor considers the analysis that you propose for all of that data and whether or not that analysis is going to provide you with two types of evaluation results: formative evaluation results and summative evaluation results. So formative evaluation results, that's most important to you in the short term because it helps you to make mid-course corrections. It helps you on a weekly, on a monthly, and sometimes even on a daily basis to understand if what you're doing and how you're implementing the project is helpful, if it's making sense. So that is a very important part of your evaluation plan and what the data should be telling you. The summative evaluation results, that's more for reporting purposes. So when you submit your interim report, when you submit your annual reports, when you submit your final reports, it's also important to your evaluator in the sense that many of them will provide you with a separate evaluation report that is separate and apart from the reports that you submit to us. Those summative evaluation results are more about making determinations on whether or not your project, um, was, value added, whether or not your approach, your methods were valid, whether they produced the results that you were looking for. In other words, you bought a product, now you're going to rate that product, whether or not that project lived up to its expectations. So that's more of like a long-term view. Your evaluation plan with respect to the data collection and the data analysis should be able to give you both of those views. Short-term evaluation, information that you can use on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis, and then long-term evaluation information that helps you decide, the worth or the value of your particular project. And again, the last part of this, again, takes you back to, as a result of that data analysis that you're done, you can tell whether or not you've met the goals of that comprehensive development plan, which again, it's all about strengthening your institution. This is an institutional grant. So everything that you're doing is to improve your college or university writ large. A well-written and well-executed evaluation plan will help you to see whether or not you did that. And if you didn't, what were the pieces that were missing? So for the budget, there are three major areas where you're going to provide budget information. This is one of those areas. Here's where you provide a narrative response that provides an overview of how the specific budget items that you are requested are necessary and reasonable for the implementation of this grant. It's not on this slide, but on another slide, I remind everyone of the 3 requirements under the uniform guidance that all budget expenses be allowable, allocable, and reasonable. That is essentially what you're doing here. And here you are providing a narrative response. Basically, you're writing an essay on how that budget that you've detailed later in the application package is necessary and reasonable in relation to the project's objectives and scope. Remember again, necessary and reasonable. The onus is on you as the applicant to demonstrate that what you're asking for is necessary and reasonable. Your peer reviewers, they they're in the field, so they know what's necessary and reasonable. So consider that as you are responding to this section. So in addition to your response here on how the budget writ large is necessary and reasonable, you will also be providing a budget justification where you you provide a breakdown of all of your project expenses by year and by line item. So when we look at the Ed 524 budget form, you will see that there is space there for up to 7 years, but this is a 5-year project, so you would use 5 columns for 5 years, and then there are 12 line items. So as part of your budget, you're going to complete that budget form, but that form just has numbers. In addition to completing the budget form, and the most important part of your budget presentation is that budget justification. The budget justification can be a spreadsheet or it can be a Word document, but you must provide a breakdown of the expenses that you're asking for by line item and by year. So for example, for personnel, say you have 3 individuals who would be paid by the grant, you would, in your budget narrative, explain who those 3 individuals are, what their salary is every year, and then you would provide that amount for each individual staff member per year for the 5 years of the grant. So we'll talk a little bit more about the budget items later. So moving on then to the competitive preference priorities. The first competitive preference priority that we have this year is for rural applicants. So you may receive 10 points if you demonstrate that you're choosing to serve a campus with a rural setting. In order to make this determination, you need to go to the NCES College Navigator search tool, and you need to put in the zip code of your campus, search for what the locale code is for the zip code of your campus. So the locale codes that would qualify as rural under this program are listed on the slide, and they're also listed in the NIA. So town fringe, town distant, town remote, rural fringe, rural distant, and rural remote. If your campus address has one of these locales, then it would qualify as a rural application. I am reminding everyone that it is each applicant's responsibility to demonstrate that they meet this requirement. It is not our responsibility to, as part of reviewing your application package, to go into NCES and put in your zip code and see what the locale code is. That is your responsibility to provide that information in your application if in fact your zip code meets one of these locale code requirements. So we provide a link there on where that locale code webpage is on the NCES website. And we also provide another link there so that you can read more about these locale codes and what they mean and how to navigate the US searchable map that's there, as well as directions on how you actually enter your information in that locale code zip code and you look it up. So please make sure that you include that information in your application. It should be included in the abstract as well as in your response to competitive preference priority 1. Let me also take this opportunity to state, and we seem to have this issue quite often. If you are attempting to respond to the competitive preference priorities for extra points, it is your responsibility to clearly label a separate section of your narrative with competitive preference priority 1 or 2. It is not the responsibility of the peer reviewers to have to search through your application to see whether or not you intended to respond to the priorities. If you are responding to CPP1, CPP2, or both, you need to provide a separate section with its own header clearly stating that you are responding to these priorities. So make sure that you do that within the narrative as well as on your abstract. If you're responding to the competitive priorities and or to the invitational, you should also state on the abstract that you are responding to those and which ones you are responding to. Moving on then to the second competitive priorities, you can receive 10 points if you are a new potential grantee. For purposes of this competition, a new potential grantee is a grantee that has not had a DHSI program within the last 5 years. If that is your case, you do not have an active grant with the DHSI program within the last 5 years, then you need to provide a statement affirming that in a separate response to CPP2 in the narrative of your application. You should also state that in the abstract, that you are affirming that you are a new applicant and have not have an active grant under the DHSI program within the last 5 years. I also want to make clear that as opposed to other CPPs that we've had in the past, where you could earn up to a range of points depending on how well you responded to a priority, this year, because of the nature of the priorities, it's all or nothing. So, in other words, you're a rural applicant or you're not. There's no in between. You meet that definition of rural applicant or you don't. Same thing for new potential grantee. You have not had an active grant with our program for the last 5 years or you have. There's no in between there. Either you have or you haven't. So again, you either get 10 points for the priority or you do not get it at all. And I cannot emphasize again enough how important it is for you as the applicant to provide all of the proper documentation that demonstrates that you meet the priorities. So we have one invitational priority, as I think all of you know, an invitational priority, you don't get any extra points. So there are no points attached to it. However, invitational priorities do signal, those items that are important to the administration. And sometimes an invitational priority in a future year could be a competitive priority. But essentially, what it is it's telling the field this is important to the administration. So for this competition, the invitational priority is, providing flexibility to students to promote educational choice. So expanding access to post-secondary education through distance education, through apprenticeships, through shortening the time to degree model, through, earning credentials or certificates. There's a whole list here of items that will qualify under this invitational priority. So please review that if you're interested in responding to it, and be very clear on how it is that you are meeting one or more of the items in your response. Again, as I said with the CPPs, if you're responding to the IP, include that information in the abstract and also have a separate section with its own header in the narrative as the response to this IP. Let's talk about the performance measures. And here, when we're talking about performance measures, we're talking about the program measures. So the measures for the DHSI program. These are not the measures that you developed for your project. Those measures are project specific measures. And all of you should develop project specific measures related to the objectives that you develop for your project. That's going to look different for every single application, and everyone must report on their project specific measures. These are measures that were written for the DHSI program. Sometimes they're referred to as the GEPR measures. GEPR is an acronym for the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993 that has been updated on several occasions. So what these measures do is they gauge the performance of the DHSI program writ large, and we depend on our grantees providing data on these measures to help us understand how well the program is doing. And based on the data that we gather on these measures, we're able to provide information to oversight authorities such as OMB, GAO, Congress, senior leadership within the Department of Education, and other oversight or authorizing bodies. So we don't require that you include the GEPR measures in your evaluation plan or in your project design, but we do strongly recommend that you include them. First of all, because including them means that we're going to have more data to understand how well our program is doing writ large or where the program could be improved. And secondly, you, as part of the work that you're doing, most of you are going to have, if not all of these data anyways, much of this data anyways, because the data speaks to such things as enrollment, persistence, completion, graduation. Most of you are already going to include this data anyways. So if you can consider that as you are, developing out your measures, and especially as you're looking at the data points that you're including in the evaluation plan, that would be a win-win for us as well as for you. We've talked a little bit about this already, so just reminding everyone, as I just said, as part of your APRs and your final reports, you will include data on your project-specific measures as well as the DHSI program's program GEPR measures if you have it. Consider them as you are developing your other measures and as you're designing your evaluation plan. So we're going to talk a little bit about using Grants.gov. We had a little bit of hiccups with, making some of the things live and getting some of our documents up there, but now everything has been smoothed out, thankfully. So everything is live at this point. All of the documents, pertinent documents have been uploaded. That package tab is live, the preview as well as the apply subtabs. So we are completely good to go. So this is just a reminder to everyone what the opportunity number is for this program competition. You can also search by the ALN number. So you could also put in 84.031 and the DHSI program will pop up for you. So this is just a screenshot of what Grants.gov looks like, its landing page. This is a screenshot of what you should see when you put in the ALN number. And as you can see from this slide, you'll see the opportunity number, which is the number that is associated directly with this competition in this fiscal year. This is a screenshot of the overview of the entire application space in Grants.gov for our competition. So you see that there are 4 tabs. The most important ones are the related documents, where we've included all of the resources that I've mentioned before, the NIA, the application booklet, um, the schedule of the schedule, the flyer with the schedule of live Q&A sessions, and the documents on creating a logic model. And then the package tab. That's actually the most important one, because that's where you will go in and actually apply. Now, before you apply, make sure you click preview and look at um, the the forms that are required. So this is the preview subtab. So you'll see on the left-hand side all of the mandatory forms. And then on the right-hand side, you see that one of those lobbying activities forms, that's optional. So you'll see that on the left-hand side, the very last form here, other attachments, it's like in a purple form. I want to highlight for everyone that in this other attachments, that's where you'll upload that DHSI program profile form, which is mandatory. You will upload that program profile form in that other attachments form. This is a screenshot of the SF424. So this is like the application cover sheet for your application package. So all of your demographic information, the yellow parts that are highlighted, those are the required lines that you have to complete, and the ones that are white are optional. So here, I believe, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing this entire slide, but I believe that exits there. You wouldn't actually click on that. I believe that's where you upload the other attachments is on another slide. So it'll come back to me why it is that that's X'd out. But the important thing is that you make sure that you complete all of the line items that are marked in yellow. So I talked a moment ago about the budget form. So here is where you will list all of the funds categories for which you are requesting grant funding by year and by line item, but these are just numbers. So that's why you, in addition to this, must provide a budget justification either as a spreadsheet or as a Word document. So this first page, part A, that's required. Those are the federal funds that you are requesting. Section B is not required, except if you are proposing to establish an endowment fund. And if that's the case, then here you would list the required matching funds that you have to raise as part of your endowment. Or some of our grants, not very often, but sometimes our grants will list voluntary matching funds. If that's the case for you, you would include the voluntary matching funds here. I do caution you against doing that, first of all, because it's not required. But secondly, if you were to have a problem with the voluntary matching, it could be an issue, because once you state that you're going to have matching funds, even if it was voluntary, we do hold you to that, because those matching funds are considered as your application is reviewed, and you could have gotten a better score because of that, or more positive comments. So consider very carefully whether you want to have any voluntary matching funds. I do not recommend it. This is the GEPA 427 form. This is where you certify that your institution will make your programs accessible to all without any kind of barriers. So let me just state at the outset, GEPA 427 is not about non-discrimination. all of our projects, as all federally funded programs, everyone is subject to Title VI of the Civil Rights Acts, where you cannot discriminate. So this is not about stating that you're not going to discriminate. GEPA 427 is about explaining how your institution is going to make your project accessible to all eligible populations. So for some of the items that may cause, certain individuals to not be able to access your program would be, there may be some type of a language barrier, or maybe some individuals have transportation issues. I mean, I'm just giving this for illustrative purposes. Please review the instructions that accompany the GEPA 427. And if you feel that you need a little more help with filling this out, we have provided a link there to a training video on how to complete this revised form. So here is the evidence form. So if we think back a little while ago when we were talking about the project design section and that factor 2, where you have to describe the promising evidence studies that you're using as support for the project components. I mentioned that in that section of the application, you are providing a narrative of how your studies support the evidence framework of your project components. So Study A said that this approach was positive with this population, and so therefore that's why we're doing this. Okay, that's how you would approach your response to project design factor 2. Here is where you actually provide the citations to the studies. So here you would provide, all of the information related to the articles. So, the title of the article, the authors, you include here the relevant findings as well as the populations or the settings. So we're asking, so what this evidence form does, it certifies that the evidence on which you say you're basing your project components, that it does exist in the research literature. So you're asked to cite information regarding the articles or the research study themselves, as well as to explain how that article or research study is pertinent to your project. So that's why there's a column for the relevant findings. And that's why there's a column for population or setting. So not just stating, yes, so this approach was found to have positive effects for academic achievement in computer science, let's say. That's all well and good, but was it found to have positive academic effects in computer science for a population in a setting that's similar to yours? If it was done with a different population and or a different setting, then that approach wouldn't necessarily work for you. In any case, this is where you demonstrate not only that the evidence that you have cited, that it exists, that you provide us the demographic information on there, but also that those evidence or research studies are relevant to the work that you're proposing to do. And I remind you that there are instructions that go along with the evidence form. So if you need additional help, please review the instructions that come with the evidence form, and all of the forms that I've mentioned before and that we've been looking at here at the slides. All of these forms come with their own instructions. So please make sure you review those instructions. So in this form, you'll see there where it's in yellow and where the arrow is. In this form, that's where you upload your abstract. So make sure that the abstract for your project is uploaded to this particular form and Grants.gov. And I will remind you that there are instructions in the application booklet that outline exactly what you're supposed to include in your abstract. So some of the things that I've mentioned before that you need to include in your abstract are whether or not you're responding to the competitive and the preference priorities. And of course, make sure you include the name of your institution, the title of your project, the contact information for the project director, and you should also include like the major components of your project, so goals and objectives and measures as well. So it's a one-page snapshot of who you are and what it is that you are trying to do. So here for the project narrative, this is the biggest and the most important part of your application package. This is your Word document where you have responded to every single factor for every single selection criteria. So this should be the largest part of your application package and the most important. Please, please, please make sure that this uploads correctly. Things happen. So you do want to make sure that every one of your forms uploads correctly, but this is certainly of all of the forms, the one that you want to doubly ensure has uploaded correctly, because without your responses to the selection criteria, there's no way to evaluate the worth of your application. So here is where you upload your budget narrative. As I've mentioned before, either your spreadsheet or your Word document, where you break down your budget by year and by line item. And remember, even within line items, you should be breaking down your budget. So it's not enough to say we're requesting $50,000 in equipment in year one and $30,000 in equipment in year two. You need to provide a breakdown of the equipment that you're trying, that you would like to buy. The same thing for supplies. You need to provide a breakdown. It's not just enough to say this amount for this category. You need to provide a breakdown of what you would like to purchase, or, who it is that you're paying. Here are the other attachments forms. So the big item to remember here is that DHSI program profile form, which is required. That would be added here. And here is where you can add, if you have letters of support or MOUs, definitely the CVs for key personnel, including your evaluator, would be added here. So anything that doesn't go into any of the other categories would be added here into other attachments. And this is the main item that needs to be included in the other attachments. This is just a screenshot of the program profile form. And this is a screenshot of the application booklet. This is uploaded in the related documents tab in Grants.gov. So make sure that as you're preparing your application package, that you reviewed our application booklet and that you follow the instructions there on how to prepare your application. As part of this application booklet, we include an application checklist that we hope that you will use as you are putting your application package together to make sure that you haven't missed any important parts. So here we provide additional information on developing a competitive grant application. And I'll go through these slides somewhat quickly just because this presentation has gone on for over 90 minutes. What we really hope that you do, as opposed to me reading these to you, is for you to review these applications and review these slides and actually read these slides word by word, because we provide excellent information here on how to develop a strong application. So I cannot emphasize this enough. The comprehensive development plan, as I said before, that is the heart of your application. If you have a well-designed and comprehensive development plan, you will have a strong application package. So as part of your comprehensive development plan, you are gauging the strengths and weaknesses of academic program, your management systems, and your fiscal stability. And this should be done in collaboration with your major stakeholders. that is the launching point of everything. And that is the main point of this slide. I've said some of these before, but let me just emphasize here that building off of that comprehensive development plan, you will, if you have a strong CDP, the project design, the activity objectives, and the implementation strategy are going to fall into place. One of the many good things about our selection criteria is that they are so well aligned. So keep that in mind as you are developing your application package. Also, remember that you need to be thoughtful about what it is that you are proposing. And one of the things that we remind our applicants and even our grantees after they get the program is, because these are institutional grants, you should be thinking about issues or challenges that need to be resolved, regardless of whether or not you got this you get this grant, whether or not this program exists. We are looking for institutional level successes. So writ large, how is this making your college or university better? And not just over the 5-year period of the grant, but moving forward, you're seeing positive impacts at your university as a whole. I've talked quite a bit about all of these items again, so I'm just encouraging you very strongly to actually go back and read these slides and consider them as you put your application package together. So for this slide, I'll just highlight this bottom part. We've provided here the citations for the allowable, allocable, and reasonable as you're developing your budget. Your peer reviewers know about this, about allowable, allocable, and reasonable. So please make sure that you keep that in mind as you're, considering prices and putting your budget together. We've talked a little bit about this already, but let me just highlight how important it is for you to include an organizational chart in your application, how important it is that you demonstrate that you have the support of senior leadership. Remember, I think it's in the project management selection criteria. You have to affirm that the project director has access to the CEO or the president. That's one piece of showing that this project has the support of your senior leadership. And of course, this goes without saying that the folks that will be working on the project will be well qualified and experienced. Here are a number of items that I've talked about before already. I talked about that internal controls manual that is required if you receive one of a grant. I've talked about the readability of your application. I've talked about using the highest level of evidence that makes sense for your grant, but keeping in mind that our program only requires promising evidence. So don't, in the, trying to be over ambitious, putting an evidence approach together that isn't, that is not going to work well for your project or for your populations. And then down here regarding institutionalization, sort of beating a dead horse here, but again, reminding you that these are institutional level grants. We're trying to see positive impacts writ large. And letting you know, if you're not aware, as part of your reporting, if you were to receive one of these grants, you have to report on institutionalization of project components. That's actually part of the reporting template. We want to see that our grantees will be institutionalizing components of their project that will remain a permanent fixture of their institution after the grant has ended. This is seed money. The grant still lasts forever. We want to see that you've taken the $3 million that you've received under this grant and that you've planted that seed and you've been able to grow, to grow products that will continue to benefit the university community long after the grant has ended. Okay, so as far as Grants.gov, some of the issues that cause people to panic, their AOR's profile, there's a problem with it, their credentials don't work, their password expired, or maybe they have a new AOR and they aren't even registered in Grants.gov. So this is something you need to take care of like now, because unfortunately, those types of issues are not things that can usually be fixed in a day. So make sure that everything is up to par with your AOR and his or her credentials. Also, as I mentioned before, make sure that your UEI is up to date. If it's expired or, the number is incorrect or there's, you have to renew it every once in a while. If there's any problem at all with the UEI, your grant will be rejected. Everything else could be fine with your application package. If there's a problem with your UEI, it's going to be rejected. And just as with the grants.gov issues, UEI issues are rarely ever resolved in a day. So make sure that your UEI is good like today. Apply early. We say this all the time. Most of the issues that you're going to find are going to be with uploading. They're going to be with technical aspects of grants.gov, with your IT system, with how large your files are. In other words, most of the time, the problems that you're going to have, they do not have a 5-minute fix. So that's why it's very important that you submit your grant early, because if something unexpected happens and grants.gov rejects your application, or say you submit your application and then you remember, oh, I forgot the DHSI project profile form, which was required, or something like that, you give yourself enough time to go back into grants.gov and submit a new application, or you give yourself enough time to fix the UEI issue or for your AOR to get the credentials that they need. Again, we emphasize this every year, and every year something happens. So all I can say is submit early so that you can deal with these issues should they arise. A lot of these items I've talked about I've talked about before. So the one thing I will emphasize on this slide, when you are talking about your project objectives, you should include baseline data. You cannot speak about project objectives and the corresponding measure if you have not included baseline data for those objectives. So make sure that it's part of your project design that you have established baseline data and that you state what those baseline data are when describing your project objectives and the corresponding performance measures. Peer reviewers look for that. And where you don't establish any baseline data, that throws your objectives, your measures, and many other aspects of your project into question, including your evaluation plan, because it also affects your evaluation plan. This is provided as a reference for you, the evidence definitions used in our programs. You can click on this link and read the entire definitions for demonstrates a rationale, logic model, and promising evidence. Here is a very nicely done sample logic model. For your consideration, you should be working and thinking about that logic model now. What we found is that strong logic models almost always start in a strong application because you're working backwards. You are working backwards. You are not just stating what you want to do, but how you're going to do it and what that's going to look like in the short, mid, and long term. Here are some additional resources on logic models. This first link here was a webinar that we did, I think a couple years ago at this point, on basically logic models 101. What is a logic model and how to develop one? So this was done specifically for our division. So, you may want to look at that. And then we have some additional videos here on creating logic models. I think these were, if I remember correctly, um, either our regional educational laboratories or one of the IES's partners. So those are also great resources for developing the logic model. And of course, your evaluator should be helping you on that. Your What Works Clearinghouse is your main source of evidence and evaluation information related to ed grants. So here is the link to the What Works Clearinghouse. And here are some additional resources for evidence and evaluation that we hope you will find helpful. And here are general um, some general resources. So this is for our division. This is for the DHSI program, and then for that eligibility, Namika Mason Clerson, she oversees the whole eligibility process. So that's her information. But before you email her, please review the information that's on the website. We are short-staffed. And so ideally, the questions that we get are questions that are not addressed in information that we've already provided. So final tips, you can read this on your own, but I will just emphasize this last one to submit early. Reminding everyone again of the application deadline. It is a Thursday. It is the day before Independence Day. Consider that a lot of people may take the day before the 4th of July off. So if there's anyone like at your college or university that you might need to submit your application, you need to consider, vacation schedules and such, but it is a Thursday. So again, submit early to ensure a successful submission. Here's the contact information for my colleagues, including my director and myself. We do ask that if you have questions specific to this competition, that you send it to our shared email inbox, as my colleagues as well as we are all working to respond to inquiries that we receive. So send your emails, please, to hsi@ed.gov. So thank you so much for listening to this pre-application webinar. We hope that you have found it helpful. And remember that we will be holding live Q&A sessions very shortly. My final request to all of you would be, please review all of the resources that we have provided on Grants.gov thoroughly, so that when we go to the live Q&A session next week, that we're able to answer more complex questions that for one reason or another may not be directly addressed in our resources, as opposed to responding to questions that have clearly been covered or that are clearly addressed in the resources that we've provided to you. So thank you all again very much for listening and for all that you do. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.